What we value most shouldn't cost more. I'm still drawn.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Chuck Todd.
Good day, everyone. We are coming on the air just moments before President Biden is set to announce that he's asking Congress to approve what the White House is calling a massive new ask for aid for Ukraine, a price tag of $33 billion. The funds would be used to fortify military, economic, and humanitarian assistance in that region for at least the next 5 months as Ukraine fends off attacks from Russia. So with that, here is the president.
I just signed a request to Congress for critical security, economic, and humanitarian assistance to help Ukraine continue to counter Putin's aggression and at a very pivotal moment. We need this bill to support Ukraine in this fight for freedom, and our NATO allies, our EU partners, they're going to pay their fair share of the cost as well, but we have to do this. We have to do our part as well, leading the alliance. The cost of this fight is not cheap. But caving to aggression is going to be more costly if we allow it to happen. We either back Ukrainian people as they defend their country, or we stand by as the Russians continue their atrocities and aggression in Ukraine. Every day the Ukrainians pay for the price, and the price they pay is with their lives for this fight. So we need to contribute arms, funding, ammunition, and the economic support to make their courage and sacrifice have purpose so they can continue this fight and do what they're doing. It's critical this funding gets approved and approved as quickly as possible. You know, long before Russia launched its brutal invasion, I made clear how the United States would respond. Predicted they would invade, and they surely did. We said we'd not send U.S. troops to fight Russian troops in Ukraine, but we would provide robust military assistance and try to unify the Western world against Russia's aggression. I said I would impose powerful sanctions on Russia, and that we destroy this myth that somehow they can continue to move without the rest of the world acting. That we deploy additional forces to defend NATO territories, particularly in the east along the Russian and Belarus borders. That's exactly what we said we would do, and we did. But despite the disturbing rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin, the facts are plain for everybody to see. We're not attacking Russia. We're helping Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression. And just as Putin chose to launch this brutal invasion, he could make the choice to end this brutal invasion. Russia is the aggressor. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Russia is the aggressor, and the world must and will hold Russia accountable. Russia's continued assault is yielding immense human cost. We've seen them leave behind horrifying evidence of their atrocities and war crimes in the areas they try to control. And as long as the assaults and atrocities continue, we're going to continue to supply military assistance. And I might note parenthetically, you know, there's a dinner this weekend, Celebrate the Press. Think of what the American press has done. The courage it's taken to stay in these war zones. The courage it's taken to report every single day. I've always had respect for the press, but I can't tell you how much respect I have watching them in these zones where they're under fire, risking their own lives to make sure the world hears the truth. Imagine if we weren't getting that information. It'd be a different world. It'd be a different circumstance. In the past 2 months, Russia launched its brutal attack and has moved weapons and equipment to Ukraine. We've moved weapons and equipment to Ukraine in record speed. Thanks to the aid we provided, Russian forces have been forced to retreat from Kyiv. Doesn't mean they're not going to try to come back, but they've retreated thus far. We've sent thousands of anti-armor, anti-missiles, helicopters, drones, grenade launchers, machine guns, rifles, radar systems, more than 50 million rounds of ammunition. The United States alone has provided 10 anti-armor systems for every Russian tank that is in Ukraine, 10 to 1. We're providing Ukraine significant, timely intelligence to help them defend themselves against the Russian onslaught. And we're facilitating a significant flow of weapons and systems to Ukraine from our allies and partners around the world, including tanks, artillery, and other weapons. That support is moving with unprecedented speed. Much of the new equipment we've announced in the past 2 weeks has already gotten to Ukraine, where it can be put to direct use on the battlefield. However, we've almost exhausted what we call, the fancy phrase, the drawdown authority that Congress authorized for Ukraine in a bipartisan spending bill last month. Basically, we're out of money. And so that's why today, in order to sustain Ukraine as it continues to fight, I'm sending Congress a supplemental budget request. It's going to keep weapons and ammunition flowing without interruption to the brave Ukrainian fighters and continue delivering economic and humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainian people. This so-called supplemental funding addresses the needs of the Ukrainian military during the critical weeks and months ahead. And it begins the transition to longer-term security assistance that's going to help Ukraine deter and continue to defend against Russian aggression. This assistance would provide even more artillery, armored vehicles, anti-armored systems, anti-air capabilities that have been used so effectively thus far in the battlefield by the Ukrainian warriors. You know, and it's going to deliver much-needed humanitarian assistance as well as food, water, medicine, shelter, and other aid to Ukrainians displaced by Russia's war, and provide aid for those seeking refuge in other countries from Ukraine. It's also going to help schools and hospitals open. It's going to allow pensions and social support to be paid to the Ukrainian people so they have something in their pocket. It's also going to provide critical resources to address food shortages around the globe. Ukraine was one of the world's largest agricultural producers and typically grows 10% of all the wheat that's shipped around the world. Putin has asserted sanctions are blocking food from Ukraine and Russia getting on the market, the sanctions we've imposed on Russia. Simply not true. Putin's war, not sanctions, are impacting the harvest of food and disrupting the movement of that food by land and sea to nations around the globe that need it. This funding is going to help ease rising food prices at home as well and abroad caused by Russia's war in Ukraine. It's going to help support American farmers produce more crops like wheat and oilseed, which is good for rural America, good for the American consumer, and good for the world. And this supplemental request will use the Defense Production Act to expand domestic production and the reserve of critical materials like nickel and lithium that have been disrupted by Putin's war in Ukraine and that are necessary to make everything from defense systems to automobiles. And I hope Congress will move on this funding quickly. I believe they will. I want to thank Congress, Democrats and Republicans, for their support of the people of Ukraine. And next week, I will be in Alabama to visit Lockheed Martin plant that manufactures the Javelin anti-tank missile we've been sending to Ukraine, and to thank the American workers, thank them for producing the weapons that help stop Russia's advances in Ukrainian cities like Kyiv. Their hard work has played a critical role in ensuring Putin's strategic failure in Ukraine, and they should know that we know it. In addition to this supplemental funding, I'm also sending to Congress a comprehensive package that will enhance our underlying effort to accommodate the Russian oligarchs and make sure we take their ill-begotten gains. We're going to accommodate them. We're going to seize their yachts, their luxury homes, and other ill-begotten gains of Putin's kleptocracy. Kleptocracy and the guys who are the kleptocracies. But these are bad guys. This legislative package strengthens our law enforcement capabilities to seize property linked to Russia's kleptocracy. It's going to create new expedited procedures for forfeiture and seizure of these properties. And it's going to ensure that when the oligarchs' assets are sold off, funds can be used directly to remedy the harm Russia caused in their help build Ukraine. Additionally, yesterday, Russia threatened two of our allies with a cutoff of energy supplies. While America has ended all Russian fossil fuel imports because we're able to use our vast supply of power in our country, some European countries have faced more challenges in reducing their reliance on Russian fuel. Russia has long claimed to be, quote, the reliable source of energy for the world. No matter what the differences are, their customers are always going to be in good shape. But these actions prove that energy is not just a commodity that Russia sells to help meet other countries' needs, but a weapon we use to deploy against those who stand against their aggression. So let me be clear. We will not let Russia intimidate or blackmail their way out of these sanctions. We will not allow them to use their oil and gas to avoid consequences for their aggression. We're working with other nations like Korea, Japan, Qatar, and others to support our effort to help European allies threatened by Russia with gas, blackmail, and their energy needs in other ways. Aggression will not win. Threats will not win. This is just another reminder of the imperative for Europe and the world to move more and more of our power needs to clean energy. In the United States, we're doing that right now. Last year, we developed more solar, wind, and battery storage than any year in our history, enough to power 56 million American homes. Earlier this month, we acted to bolster the reliance on our nuclear energy facilities, which generates more than half of our carbon-free power. And we're just getting started. I look at this as a serious problem, but also an enormous opportunity, Bottom line, all these actions we've been taking are about this truth. Investing in Ukraine's freedom and security is a small price to pay to punish Russian aggression to lessen the risk for future conflicts. You know, throughout our history, we've learned that when dictators do not pay the price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and engage in more aggression. They keep moving. And the threats to America and the world keep rising. We can't let this happen. Our unity at home, our unity with our allies and partners, and our unity with the Ukrainian people is sending an unmistakable message to Putin. You will never succeed in dominating Ukraine. Finally, we're going to continue to deliver critical support to Ukraine. We must also not let our guard down in our fight against COVID-19 at home and abroad. That's why I'm again urging Congress to act on my request for $22.5 billion in emergency resources so the American people can continue to protect themselves from COVID-19. The reason we were so successful in the past is because I was able to work with drug manufacturers to order significant quantities of material we needed ahead of time to get in the front of the line. Without additional funding, we can't pre-order the amount of vaccines we need, and we risk losing our spot in line for vaccines that target multiple variants. We're running out of supply for therapeutics, like antiviral pills that we desperately need. Without additional funding, we're unable to purchase the life-saving treatment for the American people. We've donated more vaccines and treatments to the world than all other nations in the world combined. If the U.S. won't do it, no one else is really going to step up and do it. Without additional funding, the United States won't be able to help stop the spread around the world and close off ongoing sources of the supply chain disruptions. Look, let's get both of these critical tasks done. No delays, no excuses, just action, now. Now. Thank you all. Thank you.
Mr. President, what's your message to refugees on...
Go ahead.
Okay.
Watch your head, man. You're going to get hurt. Just turn that camera on.
He's a gentleman. Mr. President, I wanted to ask what your message is to Ukrainian refugees on the southwest border and those that are trying to flee Ukraine from the violence.
We have made a direct means by which they can get from Europe, from Ukraine, directly to the United States without going to the southern border. In the meantime, in the southern border, we're trying to work through and make sure that it's an orderly process they're able to get in. But just so you know, we have said there's no need to go to the southern border. Fly directly to the United States. We set up a mechanism whereby they can come directly with a visa.
Mr. President, thank you. How worried are you by a growing number of Russian comments in the media and on some of their officials painting this conflict as actually already a conflict between NATO, the US, and Russia? They're painting in very alarmist terms, talking of nuclear weapons, saying it's a life or death struggle, etc. And just separately, or connected to that, Lavrov himself says it's already a proxy war, not a direct war, but a proxy war. So are either of those two things true, and do they worry you, those statements?
They're not true. They do concern me because it shows the desperation that Russia is feeling about their abject failure in being able to do what they set out to do in the first instance. And so I think it's more of a reflection, not of the truth, but of their failure. And so instead of saying that the Ukrainians, equipped with some capability to resist Russian forces, are doing this, they've got to tell their people the United States and all of NATO is engaged in taking out Russian troops and tanks, etc. So it's number one, it's an excuse for their failure. But number two, it's also, if they really mean it, no one should be making idle comments about the use of nuclear weapons or the possibility they need to use that. It's irresponsible.
But Mr. President, on that, Mr. President,
Mr. President, back on the border, Title 42, a number of your Democratic friends are pressuring the White House to maintain that policy. Can you give us a straight answer whether they're going to heed that request or you're going to get rid of it?
I can give you a straight answer. We had proposed to eliminate that policy by the end of May. The court has said we can't so far, and what the court says we're going to do. The court could come along and say we cannot do that, and that's it.
Mr. President, you say that this is not a proxy war, but Russia clearly disagrees. They say that war means war. So how concerned are you that they may start to act accordingly, even if you disagree?
We are prepared for whatever they do.
What options do you have to ensure Poland and Bulgaria have sufficient supplies of gas?
First of all, as you know, Poland has indicated they have significant reserves of gas that they have planned for, as does, not as much, but as does Bulgaria. And we have worked with our allies from Japan on to say that we may divert our sale of the natural gas that we're sending to those countries and divert it directly to Poland and Bulgaria. So that's as much as I can tell you right now.
Sir, how concerned are you about a recession, given the GDP report today showed a contraction of 1.4% in the fourth quarter?
Well, I'm not concerned about a recession. And I mean, you're always concerned about a recession, but the GDP, fell to 1.4%. But here's the deal. We also had last quarter consumer spending and business investment and residential investment increased at significant rates, both for leisure as well as hard products, number one. Number two, unemployment is the lowest rate since 1970. A record 4.5 million businesses were created last year. We're in a situation where we have a very different view than Senator Scott of Republicans that want to raise taxes on the middle-class families and want to include half the small business owners. And that so I think what you're seeing is enormous growth in the country that was affected by everything from COVID and the COVID blockages that occurred along the way. Now, you always have to take a look, and no one is predicting a recession now. Some are predicting there may be a recession in 2023. I'm concerned about it, but I know one thing, that, if our Republican friends are really interested in doing something about dealing with the economic growth, and they should help us continue to lower the deficit, which we've done last year, over $350 billion. They should be willing to work with us to have a tax code that is actually one that works and everybody pays their fair share. And they should be in a position where you shouldn't be raising taxes on middle-class folks. You should be raising taxes on people who everyone acknowledges that the vast majority of Republicans aren't paying their fair share. I've said it 100 times. You have 50 major corporations of the Fortune 500 companies made $40 billion last year, didn't pay a single penny. No one under our proposal, making their $400,000 a year, will see a penny in their taxes go up, not one penny.
Mr. President, about tying COVID aid to Ukraine aid. Do you think COVID aid and Ukraine aid should be tied together in legislation?
Well, I don't care how they do it. I'm sending them both up. I mean, they can do it separately or together, but we need them both.
Mr. President, Majority Leader Schumer said yesterday that you're, quote, getting closer to using executive authority to cancel up to $50,000 in student loan debt. Can you confirm that? What exactly are you looking to plan to do here in the coming?
You mean my spokesman said that?
Majority Leader Schumer.
Yeah. Look, number one, first thing we did was reform the system that was in place that didn't work for anybody, that allowed people to write off debt if they engaged in public service. We have almost 1,785,000, don't hold me the exact number, I'll get the number, 700 and some thousand have had debt forgiven, their whole debt forgiven because of their working in either as teachers or other means by which they qualify. And we continue to make that easier. Secondly, I am considering dealing with some debt reduction. I am not considering $50,000 debt reduction, but I'm in the process of taking a hard look at whether or not there will be additional debt forgiveness, and I'll have an answer on that in the next couple weeks.
How high are you looking at?
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
We heard there President Biden taking a few questions, perhaps making or at least clarifying some news he had made on student loan debt. But let's focus on the big reason why we cut in for this. We've just announced, the president announced an additional ask of $33 billion. To put this in context, let me bring in our White House correspondent, Chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. Peter, I did a little back of the envelope math here. We'd already done $13 billion in this war, this additional 33 over 5 months. So essentially, in the last 3 years of the war in Afghanistan, this country spent approximately $50 billion annually. So, Peter, we are on pace in a war that we're technically not the ones fighting to spend more on this war in Ukraine, for Ukraine, essentially we're financing this war, than we did in the last years of Afghanistan. That is a big, big ask of money. Peter.
Yeah, Chuck, that is a big number, more than twice the size of that most recent ask that the Congress approved and the president signed just a month ago of shy of $14 billion. This includes notably about $20 billion in weapons assistance, about half of that going directly to Ukraine. So that is a significant effort that the president is putting behind this ask right now, directly sending a message to Vladimir Putin and the Russians, in effect saying to them and to the Ukrainian people and the military forces there that the U.S. doesn't want this to end in a stalemate, that they want to see Russia weakened, that we have heard from some of the president's top aides, including the defense secretary, in the course of the last several weeks. There was a little bit of news here because obviously there's a process for this to get passed, Chuck. You'll remember that it was about 68. It was a bipartisan group of senators, lawmakers who supported this funding last month. The president this time around was saying he wanted new COVID funding to be tied to the funding to Ukraine. In a letter to Nancy Pelosi that was sent just today, the president said that they should be tied, but in his public comments here, the president backed away from that, saying he didn't care how it got done, that they could be done separately. That will make it much easier, if done separately, for Congress to quickly pass that aid to Ukraine, Chuck.
Well, a big wild card that wasn't mentioned at all that could still gum this up is Title 42, the issue at the border, but with the judge's ruling that may suspend the ability to do that, that actually could also clear some legislative hurdles on that front. Anyway, Peter Alexander, thank you. Today's move represents an important shift in strategy for President Biden, as Peter just mentioned, one highlighted by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who returned from Ukraine earlier this week. Let's take a listen to what the Defense Secretary said about weakening Russia.
That it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So it has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of its troops, quite frankly.
So let's bring in our Pentagon correspondent, Courtney Kube. Courtney, first of all, I saw it was sort of a delayed reaction, but quite a few European leaders gave the New York Times some blind quotes, nervous about what Lloyd Austin said, worried that the U.S. was, sort of similar criticism that President Biden got a few weeks ago when he hinted at regime change and then they walked that back. Any sort of clarification from the Secretary on his comments about Russia?
No, we'll actually hear from him later today, though, so we have the opportunity to hear more about what he thinks about how the momentum may have shifted. But to Secretary Austin's point here on the Russian losses, we just heard from a senior defense official who said that the Russians now have 92 battalion tactical groups inside Ukraine dedicated to this fight in the Donbass area. It's in the southeastern part of Ukraine, and it has been moving very slowly. It's not fair at this point to say that it's stalled necessarily, but it's really a back and forth, literally day-to-day fight between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Sometimes the Russians moving forward a bit, then the next day the Ukrainians pushing them back. We also got a little bit more sense. You can look on that map right there. You see Mariupol in the southeastern part. We've heard a lot about that city just being bombarded and pounded by the Russians over the last several weeks. There is a very small amount of Ukrainian military resistance left there, but for the most part, the Russians have really taken over large parts of that city and have had it completely surrounded. We just heard from a senior defense official that some Russian forces have actually moved away from that city and may be moving northwest as part of this ongoing offensive in the southeastern part of the country. So that is significant. The big question is, do we see more Russian forces move out of there, and are they dedicated to taking over the Donbass area? But the reality is the Russians really do hold large areas in southern Ukraine right now. They have stepped up some of their movement and activity in the maritime environment as well. There hasn't been any kind of a large amphibious assault, but they have moved more naval forces in there. There's a belief that that could be about tying down the Ukrainian military in Odessa, another city that you see on the map right now, in the straight central southern part on the Black Sea. That is a critical port city to Ukraine. There's a belief that the Russians will try to take that in the coming days and weeks, but they have not really moved on that city yet. So again, the offensive in the southeastern part of the country continues, but the Russians really have not made a lot of movement. Part of that is because of these weapons that both the United States and many allies have been sending. We now know that about 60% of the howitzers, those large artillery guns that the U.S. has been providing, about 60% of those have moved in. There were 90 that have been dedicated. We expect more to be promised to the Ukrainians over the next coming days and weeks. Now that we have this additional billions of dollars in presidential drawdown authority that the president has just announced today, we should also expect to hear about more ammunition heading to the Ukrainians in the coming days, Chuck.
Again, I don't think we fully appreciate how much of this war the United States is now financing. Courtney Cubie at the Pentagon Force. Courtney, thank you. Let's check inside of Kyiv. Our NBC News correspondent, my colleague Erin McLaughlin, she's been covering the conflict. She joins us from Kyiv. So, look, we know it's always the ask from Zelensky and the entire Ukrainian leadership is more, more, more. This is a response to that more. Obviously, this may be just a down payment.
Yeah, well, Ukrainian leaders are extremely thankful for the support that is now coming from the United States. They're repeatedly expressing their gratitude, and it's seen as absolutely essential, Chuck. You know, I thought it was telling as the president was outlining this request, the sirens went off here in the capital, a stark reminder that while Ukrainian forces managed to push out Russian troops back into Belarus, while they were successful in the battle for Kyiv, this war is still here. It's still affecting everyday life here in Kyiv, and the weapons from the West are seen as absolutely critical to this fight. You know, yesterday I was in the trenches of Kyiv, where they're still preparing for a possible Russian return. They were showing off their weapons. They showed us an NLAW, which was a gift from the British. It cost about $30,000 to $40,000 each, although they told us they prefer the American-provided javelins, that they were more effective. They also were firing off RPGs. And they told us point blank that without those weapons, without the assistance from the West, not just the weapons, but also the training, the medical advice as well, they would not have been able to push those Russians back into Belarus. So this is is really seen as mission critical. And it's not just the military support, but the president also there outlined the economic support. It's hard to overstate just how devastating this has been to the Ukrainian economy. Since the beginning of the invasion, the GDP has fallen some 35%. The Ukrainian prime minister estimates that they need about $5 billion a month in assistance just to keep the government budget going. I was out in Irpin, war-ravaged Irpin, a suburb of Kyiv, earlier today, and I spoke to a man who owns a children's mall. It's a place that you'd want to take your kids on the weekend. It had bouncy castles. There's a pet, sort of a pet store in there. It's completely obliterated. He said when the Russians showed up, they just sort of devastated everything. He's lost everything, and he has no idea how he's going to rebuild. And so many Ukrainians right now are in that same position, which is why help from the West is seen as absolutely critical. Chuck.
Aaron McLaughlin in Kyiv for us, and Aaron bring up a good point. Look, a large chunk of this money is going to be dedicated to weapons and military aid, but there is a significant amount that is dedicated to humanitarian aid in country as well. Hopefully, more of Europe will also step up. We're going to have much more on these latest developments throughout the day on MSNBC, NBC News Now, and of course later this evening on the Nightly News. I'm Chuck Todd for all of my colleagues in Washington and in Kyiv. We're NBC News. Good day.
For an hour, because you just have to get the right one. Having that at a very early age is a bit scarring, honestly, because that in a way has
to ensure that we get them as much assistance as possible, as quickly as possible. So our focus in the meeting was to talk about those things that would enable us to win the current fight and also build for tomorrow. And again, a very productive discussion. We talked about security force assistance, and we talked about training, and we also talked about the key things that we're going to discuss in the session that I'll conduct tomorrow at Ramstein with a number of ministers of defense and chiefs of defense. This session is focused on doing things to generate additional capability and capacity for the Ukrainian forces. And so it's a great opportunity to get a good update from the Chad and from the Minister of Defense and from the President on the things that they are focused on, the things that they need. That'll enable us to have a more productive discussion with the Chads and Ministers of Defense tomorrow.
Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken, I'm just wondering if you could tell us what you saw during your visit to Kyiv on your journey on the way to Kyiv, and what you saw in the city. Were you able to speak to any Ukrainians outside the government, and what did they tell you, if so? And then for either of you, do you see a scenario where international support enables Ukraine to avoid losing this war to Russia, but isn't able to fully expel Russian forces or reclaim its victory? And how would you think about such a scenario? Thanks.
Happy to start. In terms of what we saw, we took a train into Kyiv from southwestern Poland. So didn't see a lot except looking out the train windows on our way in. And in Kyiv itself, we went right to the presidential palace. We spent about 3 hours with President Zelensky with his senior team. That was the entire focus of our visit. We wanted to focus on the work that needed to be done in looking at the game plan that we have, how we're moving forward across all of these different lines of effort. So that was the entire focus. There wasn't much of an opportunity to talk to average Ukrainians. We certainly saw people on the streets in Kyiv, evidence of the fact that the battle for Kyiv was won, and there is what looks, from the surface at least, to be normal life in Kyiv. But that's in stark contrast to what's going on in other parts of Ukraine in the south and the east, where the Russian brutality is doing horrific things to people every single day. In terms of wars won and lost, again, I come back to the proposition that in terms of Russia's war aims, Russia has already failed, and Ukraine has already succeeded, because the principal aim that President Putin brought to this, in his own words, was to fully subsume Ukraine back into Russia, to take away its sovereignty and independence. And that has not happened, and clearly will not happen. Where the contours of the war goes from here, how much death and destruction continues, obviously that's a deep concern. We want to do everything we can to help the Ukrainians bring this to an end on the best possible terms as quickly as possible. Much of the work that we're doing is enabling them to strengthen their hand both on the battlefield right now, but also eventually at a negotiation if there is one.
I agree with Secretary Blinken. We were focused on the conduct of the meeting and engaging the senior leadership. So we didn't get a chance to do any walkabouts or engage civilians or citizens on the street. On the way in, we did look like things were beginning to come back to normal. It was Easter Day, so in Kyiv, so certainly a number of people would have been at home and not out on the street. In terms of their ability to win, the first step in winning is believing that you can win. And so they believe that we can win. We believe that they can win if they have the right equipment, the right support. And we're going to do everything we can, continue to do everything we can to ensure that that gets there. So we're engaged with the Chad, engaged with the Minister of Defense, and as this fight evolves, their needs will change. And so as those needs change, we'd like to be one step ahead, but we're going to be responsive to what the Chad and the Ahmad believe that they need.
Secretary Austin, I have a question about aid deliveries. How are you tracking the Stingers and the Javelins and those sensitive weapons? We're seeing more and more imagery of those weapons falling into the hands of Russian-backed forces in Donbass. Do you have a plan to track those weapons? And in terms of humanitarian aid, Secretary Blinken, there's an article in the Boston Globe today quoting a USAID official saying that the $1 billion in aid passed by Congress has not even been transferred to USAID accounts, and that much of the aid that's supposed to be going into Ukraine has not been delivered, calling it a critical strategic failure. How do you plan to fix this problem?
The first part of the question, Jen, thanks for that question. In terms of our ability to track the weapons that are going in, as you know, we don't have any forces on the ground, so that is difficult for us to do. We did have a very good discussion with both the Chad and the President and Minister of Defense on the necessity to make sure that that those weapons are tracked and as best possible to make sure that they're protected from falling in the hands of adversaries. Now, when you're in a fight, as you know, if a specific battle is lost, then you have less control over your ability to control items. But they are focused on this issue, and they know we are concerned about it, and we'll continue to engage. So.
And Jennifer, in terms of the humanitarian assistance, hundreds of billions of dollars of assistance has already gotten in, not only to Ukraine, but to surrounding countries that are caring for Ukrainians who've been displaced, who are refugees. Literally every day as we speak, aid is going in. This is aid. If you're here in a few hours, this won't be here. It's going to be on a plane, on its way, or some other means, on its way to Ukraine, and then it is dispersed throughout the country. We've had detailed conversations with our Ukrainian partners about making sure that once the assistance gets into Ukraine, it then is dispersed, as the Secretary of Defense was saying about the weaponry, in an effective way. And if there are bottlenecks there or challenges there, we're working through them. But what I'm seeing, at least, is that aid is getting here and other distribution points. It's getting out the door incredibly quickly. Again, this place is going to look different 5 or 6 hours from now than it does right now.
Well, thank you so much. Secretary Austin, you mentioned, keeping abreast with what the Ukrainians need. We've seen, certainly some 155mm howitzers and other things being processed through here. What did President Zelensky say he needs next? And for Secretary Blinken, I understand you may have spoken with the UN Secretary General about his upcoming visits. What is the strategy for engaging, for his engagement or for world engagement with Moscow and with Kiev to see it into this thing?
As you've heard us talk, or say in the past, recent past, the nature of the fight has evolved because the terrain that they're now focused on is a different type of terrain. So they need long-range fires. You've heard them express a need for tanks. And we are doing everything that we can to get them the types of support, the types of artillery and munitions that will be effective in this stage of the fight. And so we'll get a chance to, we've done a lot. As you know, you've seen what we've done here in recent past with recent $800 million authorization provided by the president allows us to provide 5 battalions of 155 howitzers, hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery. And so we're also engaging our colleagues in other countries for the same type of capability. And we see indications early on that they're going to be many countries are going to come forward and provide additional munitions and howitzers. So we're going to push as hard as we can, as quickly as we can, to get them what they need. This will be a great topic of conversation for our meeting tomorrow as we go down to Ramstein.
And in terms of the Secretary General, I spoke to the UN Secretary General on Friday, and he is heading to Moscow early this week. And our expectation is that he's going to carry a very strong and clear message to Vladimir Putin, which is the need to end this war now, the need for a ceasefire, the need for humanitarian corridors, for aid to get in, for people to be able to get out, the need for Russia to stop its brutalization of Ukraine. It's a clear, direct message that he should be carrying on behalf of virtually the entire international community.
John. Are you defining America's goals for success any differently in Ukraine now than you were at the beginning of this war? And if so, what are those goals today?
I'll just start, and I'll let Secretary of State to give his thoughts. But I think, and he's already kind of indicated the first piece of this, we want to see Ukraine remain a sovereign country, a democratic country, able to protect its sovereign territory. We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So it has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of its troops, quite frankly. And we want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability. We want to see the international community more united, especially NATO. And we're seeing that. And that's based upon the hard work of, number one, President Biden, but also our allies and partners who have willingly leaned into this with us as we've imposed sanctions and as we've moved very rapidly to demonstrate that we're going to defend every inch of NATO. So.
And really nothing to add. I think the Secretary said it very well.
Take a final question, Matt.
Thanks. Mr. Secretary, were you able to offer President Zelensky any idea about the timing of the reopening of the embassy in Kyiv, not simply the return of diplomats to Lviv? And then for both of you, President Zelensky, when he kind of leaked that you guys were going there on Saturday, said, please don't come with empty hands. You obviously didn't go with empty hands, but did you get the sense that he is satisfied with what it was that you did bring?
Matt, in terms of the embassy, we will have American diplomats back in Ukraine starting next week. They'll then start the process of looking at how we actually reopen the embassy itself in Kyiv. I think that will take place over a couple of weeks would be my expectation. We're doing it deliberately. We're doing it carefully. We're doing it with the security of our personnel foremost in mind, but we're doing it. And with regard to President Zelensky, again, without wanting to characterize him too much, I can just repeat what I said earlier. He expressed to both of us deep and repeated appreciation, both for President Biden's leadership, but also for the generosity of the American people. I think he said, Lloyd, that the United States has been Ukraine's strongest supporter, something that they won't forget. Look, we never come empty-handed, because this is, as the Secretary of Defense said, this has been an ongoing process where we have been from before day one. Because remember, the initial drawdowns that President Biden ordered go back to last Labor Day, months before the aggression. We wanted to make sure that if Russia pursued the aggression, that Ukrainians had in hand the tools they needed to stop it, to push it back. And that's exactly what happened, thanks to their courage, to their commitment, but also thanks to the equipment that they had in hand from before the war started. They were able to do that. But as the Secretary said, this has been evolving, and so the nature of our assistance and the assistance we're getting from others has been evolving.
And as you would expect, he did express gratitude to the American people and our allies and partners for what they've done from the very beginning and continue to do. but he's in a fight. And so while he's grateful for all the things that we're doing, he's also focused on what he thinks he'll need next in order to be successful. And again, they have the mindset that they want to win. We have the mindset that we want to help them win, and we are going to do that. Now, in terms of specific types of things that we were able to discuss and kind of lay out, we reminded them that Thursday, President Biden signed a drawdown, and on Saturday, howitzers were showing up from that drawdown package. That is unimaginable speed, and it's due to the hard work of all the men and women who are working day in and day out to do the kinds of things that they're doing. But we're going to remain focused on giving him what he needs to be successful in the future, and that's what you'd expect. You'd expect for him to say thanks, but and he's really grateful, but let's focus on what needs to be done. We'll get a chance to talk some more about that in our meeting with the Charge tomorrow, and I look forward to that meeting.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, everyone.
We have been listening to Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, the Defense Secretary, about their visit to Kyiv. They took a train from Poland into Kyiv and spent about 3 hours meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, discussing the support and what the United States has been doing. Volodymyr Zelensky, they said, was very appreciative, deep appreciation of the American people, while the U.S. was saying, of course, that we are in admiration of their leadership and courage for the Ukrainians. Antony Blinken did discuss the fact that Bridget Brink is going to be possibly the ambassador to Ukraine, and that President Biden will be hopefully making that assessment today. She will still have to be approved by the U.S. Senate, but that will be an announcement coming out later today for Bridget Brink. And also, he announced that the diplomats will be returning to Ukraine. They'll be coming into Lviv and then later possibly having the U.S. Embassy back in Kyiv. Very interesting conversations with both the leaders discussing how Ukraine has their strategy, their solidarity, and how they've been moving forward with this, and also how they have been just so strongly behind the Ukrainians, and that they are committed to having a sovereign and independent Ukraine. Let's get to our Ralph Sanchez. He is live in Lviv for us with some more details. Ralph, what can you tell us?
Dara, this was a trip planned in utmost secrecy. It was a trip carried out in utmost secrecy. But now we have heard from Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin, about their visit to Kyiv, the capital of this war-torn country. As you said, they met with President Zelensky for 3 hours in his bunker at the presidential palace. And this was a trip about both symbolism and substance. The symbolism is clear. These are two very senior members of President Biden's cabinet. They are coming to this country. It is the first face-to-face meeting with President Zelensky since the Russian invasion began. Secretary Blinken said it was important to have this conversation face-to-face for everybody to be able to express what they were thinking, to talk this stuff out. But substance also. Blinken said he didn't come there with empty hands. 3 deliverables, as the State Department likes to call them. The first, the one you just mentioned, President Biden will, in the coming hours, nominate a U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. That is Bridget Brink. She's the current U.S. ambassador to Slovakia. She's a career diplomat. And Dara, interestingly, this will be, assuming she is confirmed by the United States Senate, the first full ambassador to Ukraine since 2019, when Marie Yovanovitch, you'll remember, was forced out by Donald Trump, by Rudy Giuliani, the victim of that smear campaign. The second deliverable, American diplomats will begin returning to this country starting next week. They'll take baby steps, first here to the relative safety of Lviv, and eventually reopening the American embassy in Kyiv. This is something President Zelensky has wanted to see for a long time. This is probably not as fast as he would like it to go. The United States is quite far behind the Europeans on this. The British are reopening their embassy in Kyiv this week. Some of the European embassies never closed. The third deliverable, they are announcing some $700 million in military financing. Now, the vast majority of that is going to Ukraine, but some of it is also going to other Central and Eastern European American partners. The idea is to finance this new fight in the east along that 300-mile front in the Donbass. This is going to pay The Americans say for more advanced air defense systems, but also for those Soviet-era small arms, which are the bread and butter of what the Ukrainian military is using every day as they try to resist this Russian occupation. Now, it was interesting. A U.S. official said earlier there were basically no hard feelings about the fact that this was supposed to be a top-secret trip, but President Zelensky announced it in front of the world's media before Secretaries Austin and Blinken even got there. A U.S. official saying it's his country, he can say what he wants, and it didn't affect the plan to go, as you said, by train from Poland to spend those 3 hours in Kyiv. The secretaries did not leave the presidential palace. We saw Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, going on kind of a surprising walkabout in central Kyiv, shaking hands with Ukrainian civilians. That was not the case with these American officials. This was all business for several hours. Secretary Blinken said the bottom line here is that a sovereign Ukraine will be around a whole lot longer than Vladimir Putin. And he said at this point, 2 months into this war, Ukraine is succeeding, Russia is failing. Russia is failing to decapitate the Ukrainian government, their war aims in the first days of this conflict. They are failing to make significant advances in the east, and they are failing to cut this country into pieces, to try to divide its Russian speakers against its Ukrainian speakers, to try to pit the East against the West. This is a country, as we've seen over the last few weeks, very united, very determined to resist this Russian invasion. Secretary of Defense Austin was asked, can the Ukrainians actually win this war? It's one thing to prevent them from losing, but can they actually win? Can they force Vladimir Putin's troops out of their territory? And the defense secretary said the first step to winning is believing that you can win. And everything we have seen on the battlefield, everything he said he heard from the leadership of the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian military suggests they believe they can win, and they are absolutely determined to fight on. Dara?
Raf, it's interesting you talk about the symbolism and the optics, and of course they're having this press conference with cargo and things behind them, the supply chain going through to the Ukrainian people. How is that supply chain working, and are these things actually getting to the places where they need to be? Are they getting to the civilians? Are they getting to the fighters? What do we know about that?
So a U.S. official says the first of those promised American howitzers has arrived in Ukraine today. We know that some of the munitions that were promised in President Biden's $800 million aid package last week were supposed to have arrived over the weekend. A crucial part of that, 144,000 rounds of artillery ammunition. The Ukrainians have said over and over and over again, the thing that they need most badly as this war shifts to a kind of World War II-style confrontation on the Eastern Front is artillery. Now, 144,000 rounds, that sounds like an awful lot. At the current tempo of fighting, that will last about 3 weeks, Dara. Now, that is not a long time, but that is an absolutely crucial stopgap as the Ukrainians try to hold their lines in the east. You heard Secretary Blinken there being asked about reports that some funds allocated for USAID, for humanitarian aid, have not yet made it out the door, that they have not even yet reached USAID. He insisted that this is, given the scale of this operation, a pretty smooth-running pipeline. He pointed to some of the cargo behind him in that facility. He said to the reporters, if you stay for a few hours, this cargo won't be here. It'll be on its way to Ukraine. Dara?
Raf Sanchez live for us from Lviv. Thank you so much for those details. Appreciate your time, Raf. And as we mentioned, we've been watching Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin give a press conference about what's going on in the Ukraine. They met with Vladimir Zelensky. We'll have more details throughout the day of this meeting and what's coming up. Stay with us here on MSNBC. I'm Dara Brown. Now back to Dateline.
A wave of whispers spread at the speed of suspicion among the searchers looking for the missing single mother, Paige Bergfeld. The ex was in town, the most recent ex, that is, Rob Dixon, the one Paige had all the trouble with.